Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a really fascinating stack of sources today.
Yeah, looking at two sort of contrasting stories from early 2025.
Exactly. We've got former President Trump's big tour of the Gulf states on one hand.
And then Canada's moves on the global trade stage, which, well, led to that trade spat later on.
Right. And the big question weaving through these sources is, did those heavily promoted Gulf deals, backfire in some sense? Especially when you see Canada maybe finding a better deal going its own way.
These sources really give us a detailed picture. We're
Mhm.
talking grand economic claims, some complex ethical questions being raised, and yeah, a surprising bit of strategic independence shown.
So let's start with the Trump tour. May 2025, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE. What was the headline story there, according to the sources?
Well, the promotion was huge. Claims of securing immense economic benefits numbers, like more than $2 trillion were floated, sometimes even higher.
Wow.
Yeah, the language was all about delivering these unprecedented deals for the U.S. economy, big promises.
And it wasn't purely economic, right? Sources mentioned other angles.
Correct. Things like countering China, especially in tech and defense, that was definitely part of the stated aims, according to what we read.
Okay, so what concrete deals actually came out of it?
Well, there were some significant announcements. Sources mentioned plans for a huge AI data center in Abu Dhabi, the largest outside the U.S. Companies like Amazon, Microsoft were involved,
Okay.
and defense sales, too. A big one cited for Saudi Arabia, like $142 billion, and a $1 billion drone defense system for Qatar.
And investment pledges. I saw those mentioned.
Oh, yeah. Major commitments reported. Saudi Arabia pledging $600 billion for U.S. investment targeting AI, energy, tech, think Google, Oracle.
So huge numbers overall.
Officially, yeah. Sources cited over $600 billion in commercial agreements just with Saudi Arabia called historically significant.
But, and this seems key.
Yeah.
Sources familiar with these kinds of deals added some important context, didn't they?
Absolutely. This is where it gets interesting. A lot of these figures were commitments or pledges, not cash on the table immediately.
Right. Potential, not guaranteed.
Precisely. And sources pointed to history. Remember Trump's 2017 visit? Similar big talk, like a $110 billion arms deal. But sources later showed only about $14.5 billion actually materialized by 2018.
So a potential gap between the announcement and the reality.
Yeah.
That's what those sources suggest.
Exactly. A pattern some observers noted.
And then there was another layer sources brought up the Trump family's own business activities in that region.
Yes, several sources documented this quite extensively. Jared Kushner's firm, Affinity Partners, well, it secured a lot of capital post-White House.
Like how much?
$2 billion from Saudi's Public Investment Fund in 2022, another $1.5 billion from Qatar and Lunate in 2024. Reports cited said a big chunk of his managed assets came from non-U.S. sources by late 2024.
And that raised eyebrows, according to the sources.
It did. Some lawmakers, sources indicated, were asking questions about TAFARADE, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, concerns about potential influence or payback. Plus, sources noted the Trump Organization itself was expanding its branding, licensing the name for resorts, including one announced in Qatar right before the 2025 tour. Some analysis suggested these Middle East business ties really ramped up after his first term.
Okay, so that's one narrative. Big claims, big pledges, but also questions about follow-through and potential conflicts. Meanwhile, Canada. Totally different approach.
Completely different, based on the sources. Canada was focused on trade diversification, like actively building ties away from just relying on the U.S.
Especially after the whole America First push.
Exactly. They locked in deals like CETA with the EU back in 2017 and the CPTPP with Pacific nations in 2018, opening up lots of new markets.
Which made Canada unique among G7 nations, sources pointed out free trade deals with all the others.
Right. Sources frame this as Canada building resilience, hedging its bets against, potential U.S. unpredictability, a strategic move towards autonomy via partnerships.
And that resilience got tested pretty quickly, didn't it, right after the Gulf tour?
It sure did. Early 2025, President Trump moved on his tariff plans. January 20th, he says he'll do it. February 1st, an executive order hits imports from Canada and Mexico with 25% tariffs.
And the justification cited in the sources.
He used emergency powers, linking it to a national emergency over immigration and fentanyl, even though, as some sources noted, data suggested very little fentanyl actually came via Canada.
So, framing trade as national security, basically.
Pretty much. Sources say the tariffs kicked in March, then he added more on steel and aluminum. His rhetoric was described as aggressive, that tariff is the most beautiful word. Comment was highlighted.
How did Canada respond? based on the sources?
Swiftly and firmly. Leaders like Trudeau and then his successor Mark Carney publicly called the tariffs unjustified, said they violated the USMCA trade deal.
Strong words.
And actions. Trudeau warned of a forceful and immediate response. Canada then slapped simultaneous 25% tariffs on about CA $30 billion of U.S. goods, with hints it could go up to CA $155 billion.
A serious counterpunch.
Definitely. But sources also noted they kept diplomatic channels open. Reports mentioned talks between Carney and Trump to try and resolve it.
So pushback, but also dialogue.
Yeah. Sources saw that dual approach as showing Canada's independence and the resilience they'd built through that diversified trade network.
Okay, let's bring this all together. Looking at these two paths in early 2025, what's the main takeaway from the sources?
Well, the contrast in strategy is stark, isn't it? One side focuses on these really high-profile bilateral deals with massive stated numbers.
That sources caution often have that gap between promise and reality.
Right, and alongside that, the documented expansion of private business interests raising questions for some.
And the other side?
Sources show Canada methodically building this diverse web of multilateral trade agreements focused on broader,